My name is Amy Worden. I'm a graduate of the University of Vermont Historic Preservation Program, the class of 1991. On the occasion of the 40th anniversary of the program's first graduating class, we are bringing together 4 of the most influential leaders in the modern preservation movement in Vermont. Their role in shaping public policy, advocacy, and education changed the landscape of Vermont, and their influence extends far beyond state borders. With us is Chester Liebs, the founder of the University of Vermont Historic Preservation Program, Emily Wadhams, who's the former Vermont State Historic Preservation Officer, Eric Gilbertson, who's the former director of the Vermont Division for Historic Preservation, and Paul Bruhn, who is the founding director of the Preservation Trust of Vermont. I thought we'd start with each of your preservation origin stories. That is, we have Emily and Paul who are from Vermont, and Eric and Chester who are not. So I thought maybe we could start by just telling us sort of how you got here and how your preservation consciousness was raised. Maybe we could start with Paul.
I think I was probably more aware of it earlier than this, but I didn't know what to call it. But I really became involved in preservation when I was working for Senator Leahy in Washington. He had just gotten on the Appropriations Committee, and we were going through a catalog of federal and domestic assistance and the funds flow to Vermont. And here was this program called Historic Preservation, where we got 1.2% of the total money available nationally. That's 6 times our per capita share. And I kind of thought, gee, that must be a really good program if we're getting all of that money, and let's find out what it's doing. Well, that led to lots of things, one of which was his being a real champion for funding for preservation. And then Chester brought his students down to Washington to visit. Bill Pinney, who was then head of the State Division for Historic Preservation, found us and was helpful in providing us information about the program, and the National Trust came to us, and so that really kind of began the whole process. And it's a much longer story, but that was the origins of my formal involvement in preservation.
How about you, Emily?
Well, I think, like Paul, I didn't know what to call it, but growing up in Burlington and watching what was happening around Burlington and Winooski with urban renewal, and just being shocked, and then going to Europe in 1969 and seeing a different attitude towards preservation, and realizing that Vermont had a lot to lose. But in 1970, I married into the Webb family, and I was actually at the first meeting that Derek Webb had with his 6 children to say they couldn't afford to keep the place anymore. And his 6 children were between the age of like 22 and 11 or something. I mean, they were young, and they all said, no, you can't sell this land off. It's too valuable. The property's too valuable. We want to put it to educational uses. So that began the process, the slow process of trying to figure out what to do with Shelburne Farms. And at one point, I don't know, it was in the 70s, later 70s, Chester Liebs called and asked if he could bring his class to the farm, and that he was teaching a historic preservation class. And I was 76, was it? Yeah. And I thought, wow, there's a historic preservation class. And so Chester showed up, and there were all these tools and resources and ideas about how to save this, not just the buildings, but the environment. And so I started taking classes from Chester and really got bitten by the whole idea of historic preservation, because it married environmentalism for me and saving resources, Vermont resources, whether it was land and buildings, but whole communities. So that's really how I got started.
Great. And how about you, Eric?
I really got started in Indiana with the State Historic Preservation Program, and I had done a paper as a graduate student using architecture to identify settlement patterns in Monroe County, Indiana. And one of my advisors was on the state review board, and he said, you ought to go up and apply for this job. They're starting an historic preservation program in this state. And I said, well, I'm not qualified for that. And he said, well, just go do it. I did it. And I found out later I got the job because I was the only one that applied that knew what the National Register was. And that was because I'd read the brochure the night before. So the standards were fairly low, and Indiana had no program, no 106, no survey, no nothing, but a tremendous, like Chester said about Vermont earlier, that the tremendous backlog of people that wanted to do preservation work. And I got tremendous help from Indiana statewide, Reed Williamson, and the Historic Landmarks Foundation, and the feds. They came out and spent days with me educating me about the program. And so I started the programs. I started 106, I started survey, I started doing National Register nominations, and it was absolutely overwhelming. And I did not like the politics of Indiana very well. That stayed with me, but so I started looking for another job. I realized I was going to fail. There was just too much work that I was going to run into failure. And the job opened up in Vermont. I had a discussion over the phone with Chester about it.
I remember that.
I came up to interview, gosh, it was just about this time of year, in 75, and my interview was 3 days long. And what I did is really work with Bill Pinney. And the thing that really sold me on coming here was we went up, the St. Johnsbury house was about to go up for auction. And they had already sold out a lot of the fixtures on the inside. And the plans were to tear it down. And Bill said, no, you can't do that. He committed $50,000 of federal money, which he couldn't do. And the St. Johnsbury house remains. And we just worked on it together for a couple of days. And that was
your interview.
I was very impressed by the state historic sites as well.
And Bill Penny at that time was he the first director?
Yeah,
of the
I
Division
couldn't
for Historic
actually.
Preservation?
Yeah,
Yeah.
He was. Yeah.
Yeah.
And he had great courage to do things that didn't necessarily meet the regulations, but got things done. And,
That's for sure.
Then quickly from that, Bill retired in '83, and I took over as director, and was a variety of SHPO and deputy SHPO until they made the position political in '97, I believe. Is that right? They decided that, I guess, that historic preservation was either important enough that it should be a political appointee, but I got a lot. They were very afraid of the power of the SHPO, that what they felt the ability to review projects and things like that and comment on federal funding. The political people were very worried about that. And I stayed on until 2007.
You've got your life story.
Well, I didn't.
And there's more.
They didn't take me up to Indiana.
There's more.
That's probably good.
So Chester, tell us
how-
about you and
I'm what they think they call a
Penn
flatlander.
Station.
I was a native New Yorker, and I was familiar. We summered in Bennington. I remember across from where we summered. I think it's now a Delco battery plant or something. There was a farmer with a horse still mowing hay and things, and I fished off a covered bridge and had some of those Vermont life experiences. But really in later years, living in New York, there's a lot to say, but I was in high school when they were going to demolish Pennsylvania Station, and I loved Pennsylvania Station. Skies of glass and lands of stone. And was in high school then, and got kind of activated. Then in college I did some honors projects on architectural history, and that led me, in short, to Columbia University with a gentleman named James Marston Fitch. He started a program at Columbia in 1964 to begin to get some people out there in the preservation field. Then the National Historic Preservation Act passed, and a national register and criteria. And this gave us suddenly a framework for a new type of preservation, not just preserving monuments, but for passing our eyes over our heritage of the past 200 years. And there was this amazing period of discovery. And this happened in Vermont as well. And long story short, via Albany, New York, which was being destroyed, I had the anointed title out of Columbia of the Curator of History, which at 25 years of age. And then we did some saving of buildings there and learned a few things. And then I think maybe he was trying to get rid of me, but Mark Lawton, who was a director of, and that was a temporary job on a yearly appointment, and Mark Lawton, the director of the New York State Historic Trust, hands me this thing from Langdon Street in Montpelier, some guy named Bill Pinney, and they said they were looking for someone to do National Register, and I know how to do that. And so I sent him, I think I was the only person who applied who knew how to do that, but the personnel department didn't have that in their specs. So they said, no, he doesn't have the right background. He's just graduated in this preservation, but we need someone in a star. It was something, and Bill Penny's, nah. And Bill got through, and I began working in the Pavilion building in a very exciting period of time. Maybe we'll just, I don't need to go on to all those things right now, but that's how I got there. And after,
how long after you arrived did you begin to teach classes in preservation?
I was at a very exciting period in the division for, it started as an historic properties agency. It was called the Board of Historic Sites.
That's right.
It had people, Consuelo Bailey, these are very early, Bill Hart, Stan Miner are three people I still remember. And it was a Board of Historic Sites, and Bill was an historic sites guy, Bill Pinney. And he was assistant director at one time of the Shelburne Museum, as I recall. And it was very much oriented to state sites. And in the time I was there was a transition not only to improve the state sites, but to begin to look at the wealth of the Vermont heritage, begin to get it on the National Register. We getting it in land use planning, getting important test cases done, which we can discuss. And then in 1972, John Duffy at the Historical Society said, you should teach a course in this. Oh, and so through the history department at UVM in the Division of Continuing Education, we had a course at the Pavilion building called Architecture in Vermont's History. And there were 25 or 30 people. I was amazed. It was sort of like a course where you show up and they had a little cash box, and you didn't know if it would, really, they had a cash box, no credit cards, nothing, and you had this cash box, and I didn't know till that evening if I would even be teaching it. And people came from as far as Albany, New York, to take it. And now I realize that there were only two courses in this topic in New England. The other was at Sturbridge, and that became the graduate program at Boston University. And that 1972 course, and then I was invited to teach it on campus, and then that evolved to a grant, a seed grant from the National Endowment for the Arts, and I want to say that came from the Environmental Arts Program, which was in something called the old post office, which had then been called the Nancy Hanks Building, which was the epicenter of culture and arts in this country. That's now the Trump Hotel. Yeah. So everyone's forgotten that.
Yeah.
But that was the Nancy Hanks office building, and Nancy Hanks, who was going to do wonderful things for the arts in this country. I've said enough. Yeah. That's the beginning of the preservation program.
Well, let's talk about sort of what was going on in the preservation landscape beyond Vermont. We had the passage of the Historic Preservation Act, but at the same time, we're really in the height of the urban renewal. It was creating a tension around the country. I mean, I think a lot of people would think Vermont was exempt from that. Of course, you all know differently. Yeah. But I'd love to hear about sort of some of the images and some of the sort of the key cases that then prompted, Vermont's preservation movement. So,
I can think of one that got me inspired, which was the old courthouse in downtown Burlington. and a group of people got together. The bishop's house was before that, but then the courthouse and a group of people got together to say, we don't want this courthouse demolished. And had
It was
several...
after a fire.
Yes, well, no, before the fire. Then there was a fire.
There was a fire.
But it wasn't destroyed. We had an engineer say this building can be saved. It's structurally sound still. It was a red stone building. And so a group of people got together. We got legal assistance. And the morning they were going to get a stay of demolition, the building, early in the morning, the bulldozers were there and tore it down. And that was pretty infuriating because there was strong community support to save this building, and a few key people were involved in not wanting it and made sure that it was demolished. And that was
What year was that? Yeah.
early 70s?
No.
I can't remember, but I just
No, it was-
remember
I
that.
think it was,
After I
I think
got
it was a
here.
little later.
It was.
Okay.
I think it
Maybe
was
it
later.
was
I think
later.
it was
Yeah.
after I. It was 78 or 78.
So
That- that's
you think
right.
it was after the
I think-
Vermont Historic
Yes,
Preservation
yes.
Act?
It was
But-
Glenn Brown, the engineer that came and
Yes,
looked
that's
at it.
right,
Yeah.
from Boston. But before that, it was really the Winooski Urban Renewal and the Burlington
Winooski Urban Renewal is interesting because, and there's always a danger in these projects now in looking at hindsight of, did this really happen? But it seemed to me there was a chap named Ben Bosher who was in the Urban Renewal Authority in Winooski. That's a good reference point. And if someone checks this oral history, they'll have it. It seems to me we had a review that came to the division where they were going to demolish the Winooski block and a couple of other buildings, and we were able to talk them out of that.
So they stayed, but the
Yeah.
Urban Renewal
But
was
Urban
early.
Renewal, like they turned, there was a whole city, and just to turn the corner a little faster, they knocked down a whole part of downtown Winooski. It was a lot of things like that. But there also was kind of a slow burning kind of urban renewal, and that was it happened in Randolph in an early student project where architects were coming into these communities that were sort of hanging in there, the downtowns, and they would bring some architectural specialist who said, well, you know, this isn't like real Vermont, these old Victorian buildings, we should colonialize them and put colonial storefronts. And that was the early 70s, so we were putting out a lot of those fires. I remember going to Brattleboro, and somebody came to Brattleboro, I got this old Victorian stuff. And we had wonderful people like the editor of the paper, Norm Runyon was a preservationist. His wife was a preservationist, saved the Brattleboro station. And I go to town, then you get a headline. He says Main Street one of the best because those people were trying to deactivate becoming a phony colonial town and to be, discovering the essence of what they had.
I still think Brattleboro is the most urban environment in Vermont.
Intact urban environment.
Yeah, I
that's
mean,
an
because you
interesting
go down the
question.
street and it's a real canyon of buildings.
And did that happen, sort of organically or by?
Well, it's
by
organic. There's a
design?
river, a railroad, and then
Yeah.
some of it's geographical.
But I mean, the fact that
yeah.
it remains, like, was that a part and parcel of a larger fight, or
I don't think it's.
There was an architect in Brattleboro, Leo Berman, who owned some of the the big buildings, and he did adaptive reuse in them in some very innovative ways, and that kind of made the downtown viable and said that could be done. And I think he started that in the mid-70s. You probably would know, Chester.
Well, they did the Brooks House.
Tell you what,
There
the
was an
Brooks
investor
House.
in the
these-
Brooks House, and then we had it goes on and on. But the man fountain, they wanted to move a fountain and tear a building. There's all sorts of Brattleboro.
And I think
Yep.
in the end, what
Yep.
may have happened in Brattleboro is there wasn't a lot of economic
Exactly.
development pressure in the
Exactly.
community.
Good point.
That it was a great place, no question, but there wasn't a lot of demand, and so the result was there weren't people coming into town saying, boy, I can improve upon this by just demolishing this, this, and this. It was much more a local effort and very incremental in rehabilitating the downtown, revitalizing the downtown.
Yeah. Lack of resources often saves
Yes.
these communities or buildings.
Right, right,
Yeah.
yes, yeah, exactly. And
Yeah, I think less money is better preservation than more.
when you didn't have big population increases.
Where does all
necessarily,
the
right.
traffic come from? Last night, I arrived at the Burlington airport, big airport, no flights. Where did all the air traffic, where did all the flights go? But there was this great traffic jam, and it took forever to get to the hotel.
Chittenden County has a lot more people here.
There's a lot of people here now, and
than
that's
were here when you
that's
lived.
it, that is
in the
that
state.
is such a strong image now of how this county has dealt with its expansion. Essex Junction last year, coming to Essex Junction, I remember the Lincoln Inn and this nice little low-key railroad center, and then suddenly there's this new urbanist colossus that I'm sure they think is an original thing, but you see the same thing going on in other cities. Urbanism, it's by the sidewalk, but it was interesting.
Yeah.
I think a really good example of development in Chittenden County is Taft Corners. When I moved here, that was a farm. The Blair farm was at the corner, and it was all farmland. And the Blair house
Still there.
is still there. I testified 3 different Act 250 processes to tear that down, and it's still there. It's empty, but it's
Look
still.
what's around it.
Yeah,
right,
I mean,
right.
it's just
You
amazing
wonder
that they.
It's worth it.
It was farm fields, and
Who are some of the great heroes of this? We talked about a movement that became activated in a new way, but there were a lot of wonderful people doing it. I remember people who ran foundations, like Bob Sincerbo,
Yeah.
for example,
Yeah,
who made a lot of this happen.
That was the name that came to my mind.
Yeah.
Bob ran these 2 small foundations, the Eva Gebhardt Gorgo Foundation, Cecil Howard Charitable Trust. He was another piece in my progression in getting involved in preservation. There was a time when I was in Washington, we'd been working on getting funding from the National Endowment for the Arts for the design development of the marketplace. And they called and said, so we want to make the grant to Burlington, but it's not clear that they have the match. And I said, oh, I'm sure they have the match. I'll call and check on that. That'll be no problem. Well, I called, and yeah, in fact, it was a problem. They didn't have the match. They had just gone through a demonstration project that had chewed up a lot of people's giving, and they didn't know whether they could find the $15,000. So I had heard about Bob, and I thought, well, I'll just call him. And I did, and explained who I was and what was going on. And he said, of course he would help. And I was like, And
This is easy.
yeah, and I
And
said,
what was the foundation funding at that point? Was
it was
preservation?
the design development for the Church Street Marketplace. And
Right, no, I mean, but with the foundation
Oh,
more
he's
broadly.
He
Has he
started
always
the first,
been in
the first
preservation?
time that this is even before that, he funded, and Bill Penny was, well, we're going to get that money or not? He funded, in the Historic Sites days, the veneer of stone to look like Chester, Vermont, nice name, on the visitor center at Plymouth.
Yeah. Now, he was very involved
Yeah,
in all
he-
sorts of things,
it
but
was-
understood this bigger issue that it's not just about individual buildings.
Exactly.
It's about downtowns and village centers and so on. So as we talked, I said, I guess I better ask him how much he's willing to put in. And he replied by saying, well, you told me that you needed 15,000, we'll do 15,000. And I was like, whoa. And I also thought, gee,
That was
this
a lot
is
of money back
Yeah.
then.
this is a job that I'd like. I'd be really good giving away money. So
He wasn't willing to give it up.
No. So when I was coming back to Vermont, he was one of the first people I went and chatted with, and thinking that maybe he needed some staff, and he explained that the foundations weren't big enough, and he was a volunteer, but he said, so the Round Church, the Richmond Historical Society needs some help with the Round Church, and I think what I'll do is give them some money to hire you, and that's how.
You know, in
But
yeah,
Bob,
sorry, yeah.
I just want
Yeah.
to finish
Sure.
about
Yeah.
Bob.
Sorry. Yeah.
He was an amazing guy. Anybody doing a project, preservation project in Vermont, would go to his office, sit down, explain what they were up to, and Bob, in his most generous spirited way, would be so supportive and encouraging, and would hook people up with the right consultants and architects and engineers. He would provide a lot of technical assistance, and then the punchline would come, and they would say, "Well, are you able to help?" And he said, "Of course we'll help you. You know, you're really doing great work, and we're so appreciative of that." And people would go out of his office just flying, and so encouraged, so empowered, and so committed and passionate about, you know, there was no doubt that their project was going to succeed.
And this was in a little office in Woodstock. Mm-hmm. And
But it was that seed money that was so.
I'm just thinking of what Paul just said. Really, it would be no preservation program at UVM without Bob. I first met him, was introduced to him in the early '70s because I was doing we were doing a film on adaptive reuse of industrial sites, a national film. And now that people thought that was a dumb idea at the time. Now it's the most rentable office space in the United States.
And living space.
But it was a hard and living space. But I had that same experience of going to Bob, and he gave some money to the Society for Industrial Archaeology to help with that film, and so I got to know him. And then he gave us seed money. We got money from the National Endowment for the Arts. But then Bob gave us program enrichment funds, which is why, Emily, you went to Chicago, I think, on the train with your class.
Yes.
And so Bob really, and that really helped very much. He was if we only had more Bob Sincerbos right now on television and in the media, talking rationally and nicely and positively, what a world we would have, I think. Yeah.
So Bob was also, he was the first benefactor of the Vermont Land Trust.
Yeah.
Back when it was the Ottaquechee Land Trust. And he was the first benefactor of the Preservation Trust of Vermont.
Yeah. And
He also loaned money to people who wanted to buy and fix up historic buildings.
Oh,
Yep.
really?
Yep.
Wow.
Sometimes that worked, and sometimes it didn't.
Well, that's the
Well,
way
he was
with
willing-
loans, right?
He was willing to
remember a
roll the
few of
dice.
those.
Yep.
Well, I wanted to sort of keep this the chronology going here, and maybe talk about the Vermont Historic Preservation Act and what led up to that, and how that changed everybody's
I think you're
world.
going to find it very hard to have the chronology go really slow.
I know. Well, I tried.
But
But at least we
That-
sort of
that's
build up.
worth- yeah,
But talk about the Vermont Historic Preservation Act.
Well, I can talk about that because I was there.
Yeah.
What about it? It was a progression going back to from the time there was a board. This will take just a minute, but there was a board of historic sites that was an historic sites agency. And then gradually in the 70s, through a lot of little steps, that became a division for historic preservation in 1975. It changed from just an historic sites agency to an agency that works on many levels within state government and
Including
federal
implementing
government.
the National
I'll let you,
Historic
yeah,
Preservation-
and
including
you administered
implementing
it, the
the
National Historic
Historic
Preservation Act.
Right.
But that came about in these little
that
tiny
evolved.
steps that
Right.
evolved, and then by 1974, we had a governor's conference on historic preservation. And Margaret Garland, who also was famous for her being in the Women's Army Corps of Pilots during World War II. Peg Garland helped organize that, and Tom Salmon was the officiated at it and took it quite seriously.
He was governor.
And he was the governor, yes. And that kicked off an initiative where we drafted using federal guidelines that we adapted to Vermont. And I forget who in the legislature did it. There were a number of sponsors you might know. And in 1975, about the time I left and Eric took over the division in 75, We had a Vermont Historic Preservation Act. We had a state archaeologist. We expanded the staff of that agency. That's the short.
Yeah,
Yeah.
well, which did what? So what did the state act do?
I'm going to turn it over to you, Emily, or
It
Eric.
replicated in a lot of ways what the federal Section 106 Act does, which was state agencies, and Eric can expand on this too, but state agencies had to pay attention to historic preservation and the impact on historic and archaeological resources. Not just federal funding, but state funding as well.
Yeah, that's really
Act
important.
250
Yeah.
plays a big role.
And then Act 250 also, which was enacted in 1972.
Mm-hmm.
It has one of the criterion says you have to assess the impacts on historic and archaeological resources.
And
First-
at that time, not many states had a
And that-
comparable
Not
legislation.
many states
Oh.
had
that
a
did it.
land use
Yeah.
act.
There was a
like
famous case called the Brookfield Massacre at that time, and we discovered that the town of Brookfield, and some people might wish they had that road, I don't know, but Brookfield
No,
was one.
they love their dirt
They-
road.
I'm glad to hear that. I'm happy to hear
Absolutely.
that. There was one of the last villages in the state of Vermont that still was connected to the world by a gravel road or dirt road. And we discovered that the highway department was building a highway up to this town. And oh my word! So that became an Act 250 case. And again, I hope I'm right that the ruling was basically that the highway department said, well, you know, many years ago we had some hearings on this, and it was declared that was stale, and they hadn't done that. And the project to this day, you can get to Brookfield without pavement,
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
without a
Well-
land oil
Yeah,
slick.
get through. Yep. Yep.
Yeah,
You can, well, I mean, it's
Yeah.
a state route that goes through.
yeah, but
Brookfield,
there's some
and-
stretch of it that
Still dirt.
that's still dirt. But that was a very famous case, and Tom Salmon called this the Brookfield Massacre when he saw the highway being built up. There was, you know, it was kind of messy. They borrow pits and piles of dirt, and so that really, I think, put the division in the radar as a player in state government.
So both of you may know more of that, but I can't remember the history of this, or you too, Paul. But at what point was the division incorporated into the Agency of Commerce and Community Development?
Oh,
Because that's unusual. We're one of the few states that has its historic preservation office in commerce.
When I started, it was.
It always was
And
there.
I think it was, I'm not 100% sure, but I think it was independent and got scooped into there in 69 or 70, because I interviewed on Langdon Street and it was still a board of historic sites, and then suddenly it was in development and community affairs.
It's interesting that it's in development and community affairs, because people always ask me, why is it there? And I think the origins come in the state with the state historic sites, is developing the state historic sites. But I always interpret it as saying, okay, we're responsible for developing Vermont's historic resources in the broadest sense. That's the division's responsibility, and that's pretty well established in the Preservation Act, which really set us up for the survey. A very high quality survey and getting matching. It set up criteria for Act 250, the appointment of a state historic preservation officer. It did. I think it was based, Chester, you know this way better than I do, because I arrived to find it. It was
in
done.
place, yeah.
And
That was
it was modeled. I think that the National Trust put out a model, didn't they?
What you talking about now?
The Preservation Act.
No, it was put out by the
Park
Park Service. I remember there was guidelines for state historic preservation legislation
Yes.
that was patterned
That's
after
right.
the National Historic Preservation Act.
But being within the agency, Commerce and Community Development, is recognition about what a powerful economic development tool historic preservation is, and what a powerful community development is tool.
Exactly.
Now, it's
it is.
now,
Yes.
and that's very interesting, because I would say that 1971 it simply was an appendage that they didn't understand.
Right.
So that's nice to hear.
You know,
Where a preservation agency wound up was quite serendipity at the time. And some states put them in historical societies. I think there was one state, as I remember, that was in a highway department. There was. I don't remember which one it was, and so I think Vermont ultimately got a good bucket there. I didn't know. I thought not necessarily when I arrived. It wasn't bad, but it was benign, but not engaged. But I think that's nice to hear.
Well, and there have been various attempts over the years to say, should we have a cultural agency, cultural super agency with historic preservation, the Arts Council, the Historical Society, and we've always thought that it's best right where it is because of that, the tool that historic preservation is for both economic development and community
Right, it keeps
development.
preservation in sort of in the center
Yes,
of
exactly.
the most powerful
It's-
agencies as well.
it-
too,
It,
right?
it did evolve because when I first started there, and well into the 80s and 90s, the division really operated in a very independent way. I remember sitting down and doing the budget on yellow pads with
That's a little scary.
yeah, it was. But then the agency began to sort of incorporate it more because I did all the testimony. I didn't tell anybody in the 80s. And it worked, but it was helpful in some ways to be
Under the radar.
yeah, oh yeah, for sure it helped, but it helped when we got incorporated into the agency because they changed the original law said the director of the division shall be appointed SHPO.
Right.
And so whoever was director was the SHPO. They changed that before Bill Penny left, I think in 1980, and the SHPO technically has to be appointed by the governor for the feds, but they appointed the agency general counsel for a number of years as SHPO, and the only thing they ever did was write the letter that appointed me deputy, and that was the end of it.
And they gave you the authority to do the
I-
SHPO
they-
work.
yeah, well, the story about that is that Vermont was without an SHPO for a year and a half because they just before Towney came, I guess they wouldn't appoint an SHPO, and I never told the feds because everything came through me anyway. So the feds, the poor guy from St. Johnsbury didn't know he was SHPO for a year and a half.
I'm wondering, Amy.
Yes.
This might not be the right of what you had in mind, but I'm curious. Here, I don't live in Vermont anymore. I live in Portland, Oregon, and preservation is not doing so well in a lot of places in the United States now. And so I'm wondering, is it still thriving here? And what do you see? What we see as an accomplishment of what we see every day, and what is that? It,
Sure.
kind of working backwards a little bit. I mean, I had mentioned the amount of traffic. Oh my word! I walked around Burlington last night, and it has this whole nightlife and new hotels and things, and yet I see some buildings that look like they're on their way out, like Boves. Very important, very, very important structure. But you know, what is the current state here? Or is it gentrifying? Are you losing? You're not losing neighborhoods in Portland. We're losing 300 historic buildings a year. I'm just.
I think that there's probably a mix. There are those losses like Bose, and I think in the end that will be a loss.
It's sad. Very sad.
But you know, losing the building is a loss. But arguably, what was more of a loss was losing the restaurant that Bose was.
Absolutely. Well,
That was one
that's
of
a very
these
good
great,
point.
one of these great institutions in the city.
Yep.
And losing that
Sad.
is very sad, frankly. You know, we always saving buildings is great, but what is really important is putting them to good use, and that's we focus on both. And I think so. There are these losses, but I think there is a general strong support for our downtowns and village centers, and the historic resources within those. You know, it's been a while since we've had a governor who hasn't been supportive of these resources, and especially downtowns and village centers. So that's a real plus. And I think that we can give you one other manifestation of what's good is Conservation Law Foundation, Vermont Natural Resources Council, a local group, as well as we were battling a proposed development at Exit 4 in Randolph that had 1,200,000 square feet of stuff. And for comparison purposes, the quadrant of Taft Corners, where Walmart and Home Depot is, has 750,000 square feet.
Wow.
So this was 50% more.
Wow.
And CLF and VNRC succeeded in putting on a great case before the District Environmental Commission. The developer pulled his application. We and they went into mediation with the developer. Over a long period of time, we got to a point where he was willing to sell the land. And part of it was bought by the Castagna Foundation, and that was included all of the prime ag soils, or most of the prime ag soils, and then that left 22 acres of land right at the intersection, the most developable, highest value property from a commercial standpoint. And Sam gave us the opportunity. We had 2 months to raise $1 million, and we did it. Which I think is a remarkable story and an indication. Contributions came from all over the state. Yeah. We had a number of major donors who made significant contributions, but we also had over 500 individual contributions, small and large. Mm-hmm. So that's an indication that people recognize the value of protecting our landscape, protecting our working lands, and trying to encourage development in our downtowns and village centers.
It's really interesting on many levels, but one of the great things about Vermont, you can still go on the interstate, and for the most part, it's still Vermont. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And it's just so important. But Randolph was also the starting point in a way for my work in preservation education. Because this class I taught in '72. Somebody wanted to colonialize Randolph, and we brought a group in there and said, hey, this downtown's good. Wes Herwig was head of the Historical Society, I think, brought us in, and we had a presentation at Chandler Music Hall. They were going to tear down the old firehouse for a parking lot, and the town decided, well, maybe we shouldn't do that. And so Randolph got me involved. Hey, education, hey, there's something here. But also it's funny that started in Randolph, and that would have killed that. Whoa. Yep. So yeah.
So the other thing that maybe Emily should talk about is how the affordable housing community has been so important in the current preservation work around the state.
Vermont Housing and Conservation Board.
Yep.
Yeah. 40 years. Founded 40 years ago. But Vermont was one of the first states that really recognized the value of rehabilitating existing buildings, older, run-down apartment buildings that were in every community in Vermont for affordable housing, and making that a priority for the low-income housing tax credit, which is a competitive tax credit. That one of the priorities was reusing existing buildings or historic buildings, and they also put a priority on combining the low-income housing tax credit with the historic tax credit. And Vermont was one of the first states that really figured out how to do this effectively. Yeah. And so our affordable housing community for years has been rehabilitating a lot of these buildings into perpetually affordable housing in our downtowns and village centers.
And help keep those downtowns stable.
Yes,
and
absolutely.
There was a year or two ago, Housing Vermont invested $80 million in 1 year in our downtowns around the state.
It's been hugely significant.
And I don't think any of that had been possible I think the Vermont Housing and Conservation Board, I think, is a great example of that. In most states, land conservation, historic preservation, and development of housing, people are hammering on each other.
Yep.
And Paul was instrumental in this, in getting these. Now it's a cooperative agency, and I think if you look, even at the historic preservation being a development agency, in Vermont there tends to be cooperative things. And one thing I think I need to say about the progress of historic preservation is Vermont has a statewide preservation trust like no other in the country. And that's thanks to Paul. But the Preservation Trust undertakes...
Big team. This is all a big team effort, Eric. Thanks.
Well, it is, I know, but...
That was what I said in Randolph.
But
it was Paul.
But you look at the projects that the Preservation Trust undertakes as examples. The Lake House, for example, only building, it's an example of us doing our preservation, managing a building with all those difficulties. And I think you look at the Preservation Trust involved in land preservation at Exit 4, there's not a building on there that you'd want to preserve.
Right.
But
it was all about encouraging development downtown.
Yes, but that's a different approach than many have.
Yes.
And
Absolutely.
I look at the Marble Museum, and that's another one. Nobody with any good sense would have taken that on.
They might have been more right.
No, but I think the project that I'm working on now, Daisy Turner, certainly has its difficulties, but that's a tough one. And it's done in cooperation with the Division for Historic Preservation, with the Agency of Natural Resource, all putting effort into it. And I think that is what's really different about Vermont than most other places.
And there are times when there's some real differences and some arm wrestling, especially over windows. That's really the toughest.
Are there any
toughest war.
concerns? Now, I have to ask the tough question as not living here anymore, because I know that, I agree with much of what I hear, that Vermont functions very well. Are there anything we should be concerned about for the future? Is it all looking great?
Oh, I think it's always very fragile. Downtowns are very fragile.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
They're fragile and, often threatened with development outside of town.
Mm-hmm.
There still are proposals like the proposal in Randolph that would have had a very negative impact on both downtown Randolph and the village center of Randolph. So there's that, and then there's the other really big threat is this change in the retail world, and what are the retail stores that can really survive in this
What I wanted the
current
students to talk
world.
about.
So that's a major threat. I think the best downtowns are downtowns that really serve their own community first and foremost, and that involves hardware stores and grocery stores and restaurants of all types and price ranges, but it also includes retail, and there are some great examples of things that are going well in retail these days, but it's not easy.
It's not easy.
I've watched Montpelier sort of go from being a downtown that served the community. Mm-hmm. There are more and more boutique-y kind of things that are going in. We still have our Avashan's Hardware, our Shaw's Supermarket, lots of good restaurants.
The co-op.
A co-op, Onion River Sports, all in the downtown are viable businesses in downtown. But the storefronts are slowly changing into some specialty
Boutique.
More serving there's a couple of florists downtown, but most of it serves a community, but you can see a shift. And I think that you brought up windows. I think windows are probably, combined with the energy issues that we have today, is probably the most difficult physical problem with buildings that have been faced. And I think, I'd sort of think that horse is gone. Because there's so many examples of replacement windows.
Along with the retail on that, and I agree. Yeah, the major, and I don't think preservation in the larger preservation world is on this stuff right now. The other is self-driving cars. Is that going to centralize or decentralize?
Yep.
And it goes along with the change in retail. These are major things, especially with Vermont, and that's where putting a good word for Portland that has good public transportation. Vermont doesn't, for some good reasons, but I think would be very vulnerable to self-driving cars.
But it's improved over the last dozen years. Public transportation, regular bus that runs between here and
Between
Montpelier.
Burlington and Montpelier. So
Yeah,
people who live in Burlington are able to commute on the bus.
For Vermonters, this is an improvement.
Yes.
One bus a day, well, okay.
No, it's
Well,
I don't know, they're like
no,
4
you're
buses
right.
a day.
Yeah.
Well, but
Yeah.
Burlington's success, I think, is
Yeah.
bringing increasing development pressures, and my concern is
Yeah.
incremental loss in some of these neighborhoods of buildings that people are saying, "Oh, this is too far gone," or it's the same issues that have always been there. There's much more awareness of the importance of trying to prevent sprawl, although it's still happening, but in the downtown and village centers and the importance of that, that's still going on. But I look at Burlington and how it's changing, and I'm not saying change is bad, because it isn't. But I do have concerns about increased traffic and how do you manage that, and the increased density, which has been very controversial in Burlington in the downtown, really divided the community about the 14-story high building. And I intend to believe that development should go in these downtowns, but it's going to put pressure on historic resources and the sense of community in some ways, and the scale, the human scale that we all value. So that's my concern, is where do you draw the line? And it's not, it's just an awareness of trying to balance that all out.
And there's some trade-offs. I'll give you one example.
Yes.
There's a community which the proposal hasn't been submitted yet, so I probably shouldn't be specific about where it is, but it's a place that involves 3 historic buildings. One of them is going to be reused for a new department store downtown. Great. One of the buildings is going to be demolished, and it is in very rough shape. There's no question
Which
about
one?
that.
Which one is that? For me.
I shouldn't
We're not
say.
going to be specific.
We're not-
I
said
understand.
I'm
Of course, I
not going to be
understand.
specific.
I understand, of course.
at this point.
Yeah, all right.
So, but the building is in very rough shape.
Okay.
It clearly could be rehabilitated, but the rents that you would get in Swanton would not support the cost involved. And then the third building was originally a theater, and that's going to be saved. And I think that there's a really good chance that the developer will be willing to donate that building to a nonprofit organization if there's the passion in that community to start a performing arts space, a community gathering space, perhaps part of a restaurant as well. So, those are the kinds of trade-offs that are often you're faced with.
Well,
And in this particular case, you lose a building that's not in very good shape, that probably nobody would, on an economic level, would be able to save it. And you end up with 2 other buildings that become really important attractions in the downtown. So that's a interesting
well, it's
trade-off.
the same with the windows. Do you lose the historic windows but save the building?
Right.
That's the debate, and especially being in a regulatory position, as Eric and I have been in, when you're dealing with Section 106 or state historic preservation law, you're constantly faced with those decisions about how far do you go. I was often accused of being a preservation purist, I remember, and I wasn't. I know I wasn't a preservation purist, but the label that preservationists sometimes get as being an obstacle to change and to good development and economic development.
I think
And
that you're absolutely right on the issues like windows and
Windows causes that kind of, unfortunately, become.
Well,
But if you look at this type of discussion, even for this tape, it's amazing to see that in 1970, preservation in Vermont officially was a group of state historic sites, which are nice and still exist. And it's very interesting that windows or some things gets people focused just on the small, but look at the scale
Right.
of integrated issues that preservation deals with. Highway developments, downtowns, transportation. Preservation actually knits a lot of stuff together. It's not an outlier. The issue of what happens in the landscape is what brought this all together.
Right.
It's not just an underdog concept. Yeah.
And the fact that we're having these window debates, for example, is part of the success that we've had in encouraging folks to reuse old buildings and develop affordable housing in these important buildings in our downtowns and village centers.
the other thing that sort of mitigates against preservation is that the window companies are now building better windows for historic buildings. That fit better, that are right. One of the things I think that I just reminded of the other day is that Vermont has developed a tremendous amount of champions for individual buildings. We just got an email about that little railroad station in East Dorset. I think it's smaller than this room, and
I know that.
it burned in '91.
it's right on the
Road.
Right on
And-
Route 7.
Yeah, and it surprisingly, I don't know why it hasn't fallen down, because you can see the rafters in the roof. And but the town of Dorset is interested in it. Bill Badger, who's a preservation architect from down that way, and they're talking about moving it to the to the railroad location in downtown, because the guy who owns it now obviously doesn't care.
Right.
But I think there's a number of, I can't think of the number of people. I think about Barbara George and
all the work she did.
the ST Organ Works, and people undertake these projects that don't make any sense. And Ron Kilburn up in Swanton, doing all the stuff with the railroad
Great preservation.
after the bridge burn there, and getting the Agency of Transportation agreed to move a truss bridge there to replace the old covered bridge. But we have these champions that are located in different places all over the state that really make a difference, and actually give the Preservation Trust somebody to partner with.
But that's
Well,
been the brilliance of the
Yeah.
Preservation Trust.
Yeah.
And Paul.
Yes, and that's a good segue, because I don't want to end this without hearing about just the beginnings of, because you were involved in it too, right, Chester? In the beginnings of the Preservation Trust, and just
We
sort of
probably
get that
will.
on.
This is where Paul and I always have slightly different histories.
Oh, okay. Well, because just if you could just talk about the roots a little bit, because what's fascinating to me about this group and the program, having been part of it, is the interconnection
And
between
UVM graduate students have had an impact as well.
Well, the interconnection of the statewide and the state and and the university program, I think, is unique from what I've seen.
I want to mention the name Ed Kellogg then, because
Norman.
Ed Kellogg, and Paul had mentioned before when I started the graduate program, and I met Paul Bruhn. I never knew anyone so close to a senator before, my God. And Paul said, why don't you bring your students down there? And they had a big, I think this was 76 or 7, and suddenly we're having a Senate reception for the Historic Preservation Program. Oh my, how's that possible? And we met other senators, but I use that more as a metaphor that the political dimension and the university and the state, that we begin to talk to each other. And then a fellow moved from Boston who used to be, was he assistant dean or the dean of Tufts School of Diplomacy? He was once an ambassador to
Ed
Yeah.
Kellogg.
Ed Kellogg, this
Like-
wonderful man who was something like Bob Sincerbo and Harvard, and had always was meticulously dressed and fabulously generous and polite and wonderful. And there was an organization in Boston that was kind of a growing, what used to start as an antiquarian organization, which was expanding its purview as like a regional preservation organization called the SPNEA, Society for the Preservation of New England Antiquities. And they didn't have any properties here, so Ed Kellogg, when he moved to Vermont, thought it would be a good idea to start a council of the SPNEA. And we did a little newsletter out of UVM in their name called Possibilities, which Bob Sincerbo funded, which on the cover had the Brookfield Massacre story and stuff. So that council, and it's all yours, was the seed for the Preservation Trust. Paul? Yeah.
Well, I think
Yeah.
that there were two seats.
Okay.
One was Bill Pinney, who was then the State Historic Preservation Officer, was having some political problems with Governor Snelling.
That's
and
right.
so he became a little nervous about what was going to happen to the preservation program, and felt like there should be an outside advocate for the state's efforts. And I remember having lunch with Bill and with Ralph Nading Hill talking about this idea. And Bill was also part of this SPNEA Council
Yeah.
in Vermont. And there were probably 8 or 10 people who would come together 3 or 4 times a year informally and talk about preservation in the state. And I think kind of as a condition of the grant that Bob made to the Richmond Historical Society, he also told me that my attendance at the council was expected. So we went for a few meetings, and then John Fatherly
Oh, yeah.
started to agitate for setting up a statewide organization. And there had been one before, a few years before, and it didn't work, and it ended very badly and without getting much done. So there was all a little nervousness about
Yes.
moving
another
ahead
story,
with the
yeah.
state, a new organization. So what
Yeah.
happened was that the efforts on folks on the council to start an organization worked, and the Preservation Trust was formed. But it was also agreed that we would start very small. I was working 25% time, and from the very beginning, we never aspired to be a big organization with lots of staff. The whole focus of the organization was about trying to help and support and build local capacity to do this work. That if we were to focus just on a building or two, we might do some good work with that building or two, but we wouldn't have the kind of reach and success statewide unless we took this other route of trying to build local capacity. And fortunately, as Emily and Eric were saying, there's enormous passion in communities all over the state, people who really care deeply about their places. And that we have played this role of providing a little encouragement, a little funding, some nudging, a little bit of harassment at times, connecting people with technical resources, providing field services, but all focused on trying to help local organizations succeed. And that's been the key approach of the Preservation Trust from the beginning. And that the buildings that we own are, kind of not the main focus, though they often take a lot of time. I think there's one other piece in this that really helped expand the movement, and that was in 1994 the Freeman Foundation formed. And there's a long story about how that all happened with our relationship with them, but we did develop a relationship. And they have given us over $12 million since 1994, and that's played a key role in over $140 million worth of preservation work around the state. And so having that resource available to really encourage people at the local level, and I think has made an enormous difference. And then there's been this other shift where there is broad recognition about the value of our downtowns and village centers.
But
Yeah,
Paul, you getting involved in the whole sprawl issue
I was
or
going to say that.
anti-sprawl
Yeah,
issue was unusual for historic preservation
Sure,
organization.
sure.
And really, a lot of people early on would think, why is the Preservation Trust of Vermont dealing with sprawl issues and Walmart development outside of downtowns?
Yeah.
And they felt it was not in the purview of a preservation organization, but Paul convinced the National Trust not once but twice to
No,
list.
I didn't do
Yes,
that.
you did.
I did not.
Okay, to list the state of Vermont as an endangered place because of big box store development.
Right.
No.
And that was recognition, I think, in the national preservation community. I mean, a lot of places had recognized that, but not many of them were as active as the
And what's
Preservation
interesting,
Trust of Vermont.
yeah, and what's interesting in your approach was it's not necessarily an either or. It's not it
Right.
comes or it doesn't come, but it's can we find a place for it?
Right.
Can we shrink
Right.
the box?
Right.
Right.
That was a great moment of the Preservation Trust Board and the discussion that we had when we learned that Walmart was coming or wanted to come. We sat down, we had a very long meeting. I think we were at the Trout Club, Mount Mansfield Trout Club. And there were people who wanted Vermont to be Walmart free. And there were others, fortunately, we had an advocate on our board who had a long history of working with low and moderate income people in a variety of ways. And they made the case that there are a lot of people who need that kind of shopping experience. And so where we ended up through this really interesting conversation with the board was we were going to try to thread that little needle that said, that recognized that there are a lot of people who need that kind of shopping experience. But that we also have this passion and commitment about our downtowns, and why don't we build Walmarts in our downtowns? And we've had some success with that, the Endangered Places designation by the National Trust. That was really started by Steve and Linda Bradish, who were part of the Williston Citizens Group, and Constance Beaumont, who was at the National Trust. So there's all of these things have a much longer story, which we are kind of getting to the end of our time, so hard to go into. But that was the basic position that we had, and I think that has served us very well. We were able to get a Walmart into downtown Rutland. We have been able to slow the growth of Walmarts in the state, and we came very close to several years ago when Emily and Dick Moe from the National Trust, Peter Brink, Henry Jordan, who was chair of the board of the National Trust and chair of our board, we all went to Bentonville and had a pretty fascinating conversation with all of Walmart's senior management about trying to encourage them to think about developing a smaller scale model for downtowns. And they were very excited about it in the end. But it's taken a long time, but we see this working with Walmart and Target these days, with whom we've had conversations as well. And we think that's a great solution.
It's going to be interesting to see with the decline in retail and the winds that Walmart is facing, which we never would have dreamed, even when this was going on, whether preservation, I hate to throw this out, but whether at some point the future Preservation Trust 10 or 15 years from now will even be concerned in saving a few examples of sprawl.
Probably not.
Not if Paul has
Not,
You know,
I'm going to retire before that happens.
you know what?
I was trying to convince him this morning that texture 111 is is historic fabric. And he's
The interesting thing is that it's always up to the next generation. You leave things, and each generation kind of decides.
Mhm. What's
And
important.
and that'll be a very interesting thing. I won't be there either, probably.
One of the things that the Preservation Trust did was start this whole idea of field services, and I can't remember what year it was,
1998.
and which the staff goes out in the community, and Paul did at least two smart things, probably a lot more, but one is, okay, we're going to make this half-time positions so we can get a variety of people. And second is that he hired experienced people, whereas most of the statewide hire the newbies get to go out in the field.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're experienced and go out in the field, you can really help people right there. Big difference. And
Good point.
I did field services for 10 years and loved it.
That's when I rescued you from state
Yeah,
government.
Paul rescued me from state government, but
And rescued state government from you.
yeah.
I think another unique thing about Vermont is, and Chester, you touched on this, but the Preservation Trust is an advocacy organization. State government is not. And you can try to advocate. Your job in state government as the state historic preservation officer is obviously to advocate for historic resources, but having the Preservation Trust of Vermont be a partner and being the one
huge
that
difference.
can be the public the private advocate, so to speak, for historic resources and support the regulatory agency that's sometimes out there without a lot of support was really invaluable in this
I always wanted Paul to criticize that we weren't doing enough preservation at the state, because I always think the state always has to take, the state employee always has to take something close to the middle position. It has to be.
That's why you need the
you need somebody out there that
Exterior.
hollers.
I was
The state's not doing enough, and
Yeah.
Paul did it in a more gentle way. The grant programs we started, still going strong, still supported by the legislature. Paul was absolutely instrumental in starting those for Barnes. Barnes were 92, the first program in the country, and then for historic resources. And they get a regular appropriation. It's not enough, but it's there every year.
Yep.
Yeah.
And
It's more than
been
any
there
other
ever
state.
since. And that is a tremendous incentive for
Yep.
people to do things. It's just that there's a program there.
Yeah.
I think having the university program.
Well,
I mean, this is
Yeah.
what 2 hours
Absolutely.
with Emily and Amy, both graduates when I was there. But it's done two things. It's also trained a lot of national leaders. I was listening to a lecture in Portland, a big lecture on the future of Portland, Oregon, and they were quoting Jim Lindbergh, who's head of the National Trust Preservation Green Lab. But constantly, Emily you were vice president for
public policy.
public policy at the National Trust. Amy you were a reporter for the Washington Post. And says we were able to attract this incredible, because preservation can be so many things, and we set up that program to bring in people from a vast amount of different backgrounds, and it very much reflected in what we're talking about. And a core of them have stayed in Vermont. I understand have done a lot with Preservation Burlington and other things.
And also brought
But-
the Vermont ethic out into
and,
Yeah.
and
So
the division has a lot of people. They coming out of the program, a lot of the professionals have staffed various preservation
and
organizations.
Chester taught us, one, passion, and two, advocacy. I mean, you were really a voice for advocacy. We had the technical training. We had Ed Kellogg teach a brilliant course in law. Your Historic Preservation 101 overview class was one of the best classes I've ever had in my life.
Yes.
And so, but it wasn't just the technical side of preservation and historic buildings and historic architecture. It was really the passion and the need to advocate for these.
I always
Resources.
looked at advocate comes out. I think it's in the Preservation Act that State Historic Preservation I was supposed to advocate. I looked at it as in its root word, to speak for, which is a Latin root, which makes that there's somebody that's out there speaking for historic buildings, and it got me in trouble from time to time doing that and saying that. But,
And it's
Well,
not just,
can I,
yeah, sure,
I'd
please.
like to comment about the program, because you're right, the program has produced a lot of national leaders, leaders of other statewide organizations around the country. Some of the better local organizations are run by graduates of the program. It's had a tremendous impact nationwide. But since I care mostly about Vermont, that the program has been enormously important to us. It's always fun for me to spend time with my colleagues from around the Northeast, and we do it once a year for 3 or 4 days, and none of them have active programs. And we've had the UVM program here, and a batch of the people who come to that program come to Vermont and say, "Wow, I've got to figure out how to stay here. This is."
So I always thought
this
the
is
challenge was to get some of them out too.
Right. And
You pushed us out. You were disappointed that I was going to stay in Vermont.
and
I left finally.
It's had a tremendously positive impact on Vermont. We have lots of great preservation consultants around the state. Other states don't have that base of technical and professional, well-educated preservation folks, and that's been inured to Vermont's benefit in enormous ways.
And the program didn't, the University of Vermont didn't say, "Oh, we want a preservation program," and put out a job description. It grew organically, and actually there was a lot of skepticism at first, even within the university and other people, of the importance of having such a thing, and it's not real history. And so it's nice that it's done that and endured. Yeah.
I think the difference between the UVM program and many other programs around the country is, you learn historic architecture at UVM, you learn that kind of thing, but you also learn the advocacy.
And the community organizing.
The community organizing, which
and the interrelationship.
Yeah, which most programs are more academic and more research oriented. Not to say that the program is not academic. It's but it's a little bit different.
Yeah. Well, thank you, everybody. I think we've come to the end of our time. So
Thank you, Amy.
so
Do you have
much
anything
for
you want to
listening.
add?
I do not. I'm simply here as the
Do you
facilitator.
have a summary? Or, no, sorry, this was your idea to do this, Amy. Do you have any parting thoughts for the record?
I'm just thrilled that everybody could get together, and it's important to have a record. So.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Amy.
Well, thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks.